Hey guys, it's Kathleen here again, and I am so excited about this week's interview. But before we introduce our guests, I want to ask you to show Crime Story some love and hit that follow button on your podcast app. Better yet, if you know someone who you think might enjoy the show, share it with them. Don't be shy. Shares and follows go a long way in supporting the work we do, and we would so appreciate your help. Thanks, and without further ado, here's our episode.
Or maybe this is the bathroom.
Yeah, that's...
You're right, this is the bathroom.
I will never forget when I first heard this wild piece of tape.
There it is. You're caught.
It was the winter of 2015, and my husband and I were sitting on the couch watching the last episodes of the Jinx. For 5 weeks, we'd been enthralled by the strange life of Robert Durst, a wealthy real estate heir suspected of 3 murders. First, it was his wife, Kathy McCormick, who disappeared in 1982. And then it was his best friend, Susan Berman, who was murdered in 2000. And then it was his neighbor, Morris Black, in 2001. And in all of these cases, Robert Durst just walked away. That was until the final moments of the Jinx. When Durst thought that the filmmakers were no longer recording, he made this shocking confession.
Killed them all. Of course.
I think both my husband and I screamed when this tape first aired. And then we just sat there shocked, staring at the screen. What the hell just happened? And then we thought, what the hell is going to happen next? We had to wait 9 years to find out. Director Andrew Jarecki and his co-producer Zac Stuart-Pontier are finally back with a new season of The Jinx. Andrew and Zac, welcome to Crime Story.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
It's so exciting to have you guys. And I have to admit, part of me wants to make sure if you're ever in Toronto, we can sit down and talk for 6 hours because I want to go over every single person that was on that your program and everything that happened. And we don't have that time. But it was such a phenomenon in my home and we just loved it. And I want to talk to you about all of that. But let's just set ourselves a little bit up for people who aren't completely sure who all these characters are. And there are tons of characters and we're not going to get to them all. But sort of most succinctly as you can, who were the Dursts and who was Robert Durst to the family?
The Dursts are a wealthy real estate family in New York, but not to understate that. They are arguably the wealthiest and most powerful of the private real estate fortunes in New York. You know, there are big companies that are public that own a lot of real estate, but in terms of just a family that privately owns buildings, they own 10 or 11 skyscrapers in Manhattan, including the Bank of America Tower. They built the Freedom Tower on the old World Trade Center site. In terms of who Bob is in that family, he was always trouble. Seymour, his father, needed an heir, and he assumed that his eldest son, who was quite smart, would eventually realize that was the right path for him. Meanwhile, Bob, who was kind of punk rock and very opposed to the idea of a life wearing a tie and going to work and looking at spreadsheets. Bob always sort of thumbed his nose at that. And then, of course, he had his younger brother, Douglas, who was dying to take over the business, couldn't believe that his father was even considering his violent, obnoxious older brother, who obviously had social problems and talked to himself and burped in meetings. And so there was always a lot of tension in that family, and then there were a couple of other siblings. And so at a certain point, I think Seymour has to decide that it's time to move on to the second sibling, namely Douglas.
Zac, you host the companion podcast for this, and there is a story in there about Bob and sushi that made me feel sick. I could not get over it. So can you tell people that story? And it will just sort of give some more weight to what Andrew had to say about how crazy Bob was even before maybe he started killing people.
Yes, and the way we found out about this was also kind of wild in that Bob was arrested. Before he was arrested for the murder of Susan Berman, Bob was arrested for peeing on candy at a Houston CVS. So that's just a mouthful.
Something I suspect you'd never thought that you would be saying ever, let alone in your professional work.
That was an alternative title for the podcast. That's just a mouthful.
So Andrew was talking to Bob at this time, and basically Bob says, I've always been peeing in strange places. And he recounts this story that when he was with the Durst organization, would have monthly lunches, and they would order sushi. And Bob says he and some of the other disgruntled employees would pee on the sushi. And he says, and this was from a
they'd kind of they'd sort of like sneak into the kitchen before it was served to the executives, and then quietly pee on the sushi so that it was not known.
And Bob's surprised that nobody knew, because it was a nice place. You'd think they'd know that the sushi had been swimming in pee.
Ugh. Did you get Succession vibes?
Succession connection, I think, is real, and Jesse Armstrong was very kind about talking about the Jinx as an inspiration for Succession. And then interestingly also, if you watch the opening credits of All Good Things, the feature film that I made before we made the Jinx about Bob Durst, the whole opening credit sequence of kind of a wealthy family in a fancy neighborhood in the suburbs and a birthday party with a pony and people getting tennis lessons. Clearly they'd watched that and were inspired by that as well, which I was flattered by, just because Succession is really a fantastic accomplishment.
Quickly, Andrew, just tell us about that, because that is how this all happened. You made that movie, which was a fictional sort of depiction of the story, but Bob saw it, right?
Yeah, Bob actually heard about it because we had made this movie called All Good Things, where Ryan Gosling plays Bob Durst and his wife is played by Kirsten Dunst. And we had reached out to him before and said, through his lawyer, we'd like to talk to Bob. We're writing a movie about him. And they kind of, were polite, but they didn't engage. And then all of a sudden, the movie's about to come out in 2010. And we get a call from the real Bob Durst saying, hey, I hear this movie's coming out. I'd like to see it. I end up on the phone with him and I say, well, I'd like you to see it. So why don't we arrange for you to see it? So I went out to LA and I set up a screening for him to see it. And it was my first time meeting Bob and shaking his hand and thinking to myself, that was the hand that he used with the bow saw so that he could chop up Morris Black. So it was an interesting experience to see him for the first time and to connect with the guy I'd been writing a movie about for 5 years. And he saw the movie at 3:00. He said to me, when I'm done with the movie, I'm probably not going to call you for a while, maybe a few days, because it'll need to sink in. And I said, yeah, whatever, makes sense. And then the movie ended at 4:50 and he called me at 4:55 and I picked up the phone and I saw it was him. And he said, I want you to know I liked the movie very much. Kirsten Dunst was just like my wife, Kathy. I cried 3 times. We should talk about doing something together. And I just said at that point, well, why don't we just do an interview? I don't really know where this is going, but why don't we just sit down with you? And it's going to take a few days. So we ended up shooting about 20 hours of interview footage with him. And that became the spine of the Jinx, which was never really the original intention. It was sort of like, we don't know where this is going. And in fact, on the first morning of the first day of the interviewing, we decided to kind of have a slow ramp in by letting him come to a recording studio, not filming him yet, having him come to a recording studio and watch the movie and do a director's commentary with me, where he's just reacting to the movie. Oh, well, that was accurate. That reminds me of when I was a kid. And there was nothing very notable about it. But I knew that there's a scene that was coming up where they're at a party for Kathy. Mm-hmm. And as Bob did, he was getting very annoyed that the attention was on her and it was all about her success and her going to medical school. And he says, well, let's get out of here. I want to go home. And she says, well, this party's for me. I don't want to leave. Then he gets really angry and he pulls her out of the party by her hair. And this was the first time anybody in her family had seen the violence between them in the relationship. And it was so brazen. And I thought to myself, well, Bob is going to watch this. And he's, of course, like anybody in his position would, he's probably going to say, well, Andrew, of course, that wasn't realistic. I would never have done that. And so I was sort of hesitant. And then the scene pops up and he's staring at it. And he says in a very dispassionate way, while we're seeing this very violent scene, he says, oh, I've heard this.
Seen the story about the hair 2 different ways. One way, I drag her out of the house by her hair. The other way, I grab her hair and a big chunk comes out. Either one is close enough.
Is close enough.
Ugh.
And so I thought, well, now this is going to be a very interesting day and 2 and 3 days of filming with a guy who's very willing to say things that the average person might not say. And of course, that characterizes Bob.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we need to settle into Kathy right now, because it all really does sort of start and revolve around her disappearance, right? So can you give us a sense of what you guys learned about sort of the year, I guess, leading up to what happened to her and the suspicion around what happened to her?
Yeah, we actually learned a lot more about this than we expected. Kathy and Bob's marriage was in a very bad spot. We know that they were moving towards a divorce and that it was getting very heated in terms of the negotiations. We know that she had files that she had taken from him that she was sort of using to negotiate with. She told Bob's family that she was getting a divorce and that he was beating her and that she had these files, and they did very little. And when she disappeared on January 31st, 1982. She went to a party at a friend's house and then came home to their lakeside cottage in Lake Truesdale. And
that's in New York State, is that correct?
That's in upstate New York.
Okay.
Yeah. And so Bob doesn't report her missing for 5 days. And he reports her missing in a very smart way in New York City. There's no evidence that she actually got back to the city. It's extremely likely that he killed her up at their lakeside cottage, but he focused the entire investigation in New York City. And that was one of the more clever things that he did. And it's a big reason why he was able to get away with that.
Because he says she left their cottage to go back to school, right? That she was at medical school, as Andrew, you alluded to earlier. And he actually sort of somehow showed evidence that she had actually arrived.
Yes. And there's a very important call to the medical school.
Right.
And that call is what places her alive the following week. And there's a lot of evidence that call was made by Susan Berman, impersonating Kathy.
Let's get to Susan Berman. Before I do that, I just want to ask you, either one of you can answer, was anybody ever charged? Were they always suspicious of Bob but couldn't get him? What was happening? Because Kathy was never found, right?
For all intents and purposes, this went unsolved for decades. And then in 2000, it's reopened by the Westchester District Attorney's Office, and they start reinvestigating this murder of Kathy, or this disappearance of Kathy. And one of the people they want to talk to is Susan Berman, who was Bob's spokesperson at the time of Kathy's disappearance. And before they can speak to her, she's murdered in Los Angeles.
She's murdered. So let's get Andrea to tell us this part of the story. What happens to Susan? Maybe before that, just tell us about the relationship between Susan and Bob, because that is really fascinating.
Well, Bob and Susan had met at UCLA. He was in graduate school studying for an economics degree, which he would later say that he received, but then would later admit that he had lied about receiving because he didn't. And Susan, he describes as this kind of like firecracker of a girl who was attractive and had this, blunt kind of black bangs haircut, and obviously she had a big personality, and they hit it off, and they became fast friends. They didn't have a romantic relationship, but they became sort of each other's confidants. And this went on for their whole lives. So to Bob, it was a very meaningful relationship. And I think for Susan, it was even more of a big deal because he was a really rich guy from New York. He sort of was the ultimate kind of Jewish American prince as far as she was concerned. And that was great for her. Also, he had kind of a commanding presence, and she was the daughter of a quite well-known mobster named Davy the Jew Berman, who was partners with Bugsy Siegel in the Flamingo Hotel. Susan Berman's picture was over the desk in the lobby. Liberace played at her birthday party when she was a kid. So she had this kind of folklore around her, and Bob had this pedigree of wealth and privilege. And so it kind of worked for both of them. And then they stayed friends for, forever. And over time, Susan Berman, became a magazine writer, eventually started trying to write screenplays. She made a deal. She moved out to Hollywood and became a screenwriter, but it never really panned out for her. And at a certain point, she starts asking Bob to help her out financially because she doesn't have enough money to live on. And then as she gets to the later part of her life, she gets more persistent, more insistent that he should help her. She's been there for him. And of course, the big question is, at the time that Kathy went missing, where was Susan Berman?
Yeah.
Susan was Bob's best friend. Well, she didn't have no role in it. In fact, she was sort of appointed by Bob to be his spokesperson. And she's the one that speaks to the Post, speaks to the Daily News. She's out there selling the story of Kathy. And she's quite pointed about trying to, she acts as if she's Kathy's dear friend, but the reality is she's besmirching Kathy at every turn. She keeps, throwing in these little details like, well, Kathy was, she drank. Well, she did coke. Well, she was a medical student. She wrote her own scripts. No evidence of any of that.
And she was failing.
No evidence that, and that she was failing medical school. So Susan Berman really was deeply involved in trying to take the attention off of Bob as the killer.
And Zac, she was also involved to the point where, and you can explain it, she was able to push him and scare Bob. What did she have over Bob in terms of the murder of Kathy or the disappearance of Kathy that might have got her killed?
One of the things that is heavily featured in part 2 is this call that's recorded 9 days after Kathy went missing between Albert Goldman and Susan Berman. Albert Goldman was an author, a journalist at the time. And you can really hear Susan doing all the stuff that Andrew mentioned, like trashing Kathy, planting this story.
Personally, between you and me, Albert, and never to be quoted, okay?
Yeah.
I think she's dead.
I think so, too.
Yeah. I think she was kidnapped. She was a beautiful girl. Like she drinks. Kathy did coke, and she dresses like I do. The only difference is she had diamond earrings on, okay? Okay, so she's like, looks wealthy because she's so pretty,
So basically, when they reopen the investigation, Susan's on really hard times. And after she was murdered, the police discover on her computer a note that was sent to Bob that makes it seem like they've been arguing recently. She says, I hope the last time we spoke is not the last time forever. I've always cared about you, and our relationship was never about money. And you get this feeling, and Bob admits this on the stand, that Susan is kind of loosely shaking him down, saying, remember what I did for you. I need help. And Bob is in a very precarious situation.
Because you guys think that she made that call to Kathy's medical school. She was pretending to be Kathy, right?
She told people that she made the call to the medical school pretending to be Kathy.
Yeah. So how does Susan die? What do we find out about her murder?
Susan's murdered on December 23rd, 2000. She's shot in the back of the head. She's paranoid, so she let this person in, which is surprising, which people assume that this was somebody that she knew. A letter is then sent to the police.
An anonymous letter.
Alerting them. An anonymous letter is sent to the police called the cadaver note. It says 1527 Benedict Canyon. It's addressed to Beverly Hills Police. Beverly is spelled wrong.
With an extra E.
And inside it says cadaver. And so that, again, leads the authorities to believe that this was somebody that knew her, that wanted her body to be discovered.
And then, so do they turn to Bob? Like, what does this do to Bob's life after Susan is killed?
They actually don't suspect Bob as much as you would think. This investigation by the LAPD is kind of botched. The crime scene wasn't secured. Susan was not well liked, so there were other suspects. They were very focused on a manager for a while, also a landlady. They were kind of not on the tip of Robert Durst until after Galveston.
Right, Galveston. Because before Bob can really be investigated for Susan's murder, he takes off to Texas. Andrew, can you explain this part?
Well, it's kind of interesting. So it was clear that he learned there was this investigation. He thought, well, this thing now, 17, 18 years later, is popping back up again. I got to get out of sight. And that's why he went to Galveston, moved into a $300 a month rooming house there, moved in under a false name, Dorothy Signer, and began posing as a mute woman. And so he was kind of hiding out in Galveston, slumming, living in a very modest way. And he met this neighbor of his across the hall, this elderly drifter named Morris. And the two of them, according to Bob, hung out together. They went out to Pelican Island, this place off Galveston, and they did shooting practice. And basically two old guys who liked guns, as far as Bob described it. But, he was clearly in Galveston to avoid scrutiny. And then somehow, at a certain point, he hears from Susan Berman that the police have contacted her and they want to talk to her about the disappearance of Kathy Durst. And did Bob have an opinion about that? And Bob tells me in the interview, well, I said, yeah, that's fine. You want to talk to police? Sure, do whatever you want. Obviously, Bob would not have felt that way. Bob probably genuinely was quite concerned about it. But one of the most amazing parts about it is the police had actually not contacted Susan Berman. So only Bob thought the police had contacted Susan Berman, probably because Susan Berman told him that.
Yeah.
And if you assume that Susan Berman was kind of an operator and was a, Machiavellian person and was in a very desperate situation, you go back to, well, if I've got no money and I've got no prospects, who was in the past somebody who was a resource for me? Well, Bob was there to give me money over the years, so let me ask him to do more of that. And I think Bob saw that as a betrayal. Here's a person that he really has taken care of and has been a good friend to. And suddenly she's saying, well, by the way, I might talk to the police. And I think he saw that as very dangerous for him because he did know that Susan Berman knew where some of the bodies were buried, or let's say at least she knew either what had happened to Kathy or
Yeah, she's gonna have some pretty good evidence for the police.
For sure. The other thing that's happening this time, there's another character in the mix, which is Bob's remarried, Debbie Sheraton. And Susan and Debbie notoriously didn't get along.
That's what I was saying about this story. You think we've hit all the strange points, and then it just goes in another direction. And the next direction it goes after Bob flies to California, does kill Susan, we know that now, comes back, he decides that he's not done with this, and the next thing we know, his buddy Morris is found chopped up in pieces. So who wants to tell us what happened to poor Mr. Black?
So 3 things happen. One is, and we can plant the seed for further discussion, Bob gets married in New York to this woman, Deborah Lee Sheraton, whom he's known for many, many years. And then the next day, he buys a ticket to fly out to California to kill Susan Berman. And then he kills Susan Berman. And 9 months later, a body washes up on the shore in Galveston, and a boy and his father notice this thing floating in the water, and they think maybe it's a dolphin or something. They get closer to it, and they realize it's a torso of a person. No arms, no legs, and no head. And it's just kind of bumping up against the seawall. And they call the police. The police come, and they look out into Galveston Bay, and they see that there are a whole bunch of black plastic trash bags that are floating in the bay. They bring the bags in, and they open them up, and they see that they are containing the rest of the body parts, except for the head. But they look through the bags, and they find that there's some extra evidence floating around in the bags because they were actually trash bags with some trash in them. And one of the pieces of trash in one of the bags is a local newspaper that has a mailing address on it on Avenue K, which is the rooming house where we now know Bob was living. They go to this rooming house on Avenue K. They ask the landlord, are you missing anybody? And he says, well, there's a guy, Morris Black, who's been living here. We haven't seen him in a little while. And they say, well, tell us more about him. Well, he's this older guy. And does he have any friends? Yes, he's got a friend. There's a woman that lives across the hall, this woman named Dorothy Siner, but she doesn't really say anything because she's a mute. Okay, is there anybody else in the mix? Oh, yeah, well, there's another guy who's actually her nephew from New York, some guy named Robert Durst. They don't know that that's a famous name because it's not really a famous name in Texas. And he says this guy, Robert Durst, is her nephew. He lives in New York, and he comes out here sometimes. And when she's not in the apartment or she goes off on a business trip, he uses the apartment. And then when he leaves, she uses the apartment. And they say, well, can we look into the apartment? And they go into the apartment, and they notice 2 things. First, they see some cuts in the linoleum and the floor. And they pull up the linoleum and they see that there are large blood stains under that. So quickly they surmise that means that's where Morris Black was dismembered. And then they look around the apartment and they notice things like a wig stand. And they realize pretty quickly that there's only ever been one person living in that apartment, and it is Robert Durst, this person they don't know much about, disguised as a mute woman. But it all kind of comes to a head because he gets arrested in a complicated way that we show in the first part of the Jinx.
Because he comes back to pick up his eyeglasses. It's the strangest thing.
Yes.
So there's an eyeglass receipt that they find, and then the detective goes to the eyeglass store and says, hey, do you remember this guy? Yeah, he's supposed to come in and pick up his glasses in a few days. All right, if he does come in, here's my card, let me know if he does. And then, of course, the detective's pager goes off, and he realizes Bob Durst come to pick up his glasses, and they go and arrest him, and he's driving his little Honda CRV, and they look around the back, and they see through the window that there's a bow saw in the bed of the Honda CRV. And then they bring him in, and they say, we're going to charge you with murder, and your bail's been set at $250,000. And he says, well, how do I get out of here? And the detective says, well, jokingly, well, do you have $250,000? And Bob, who kind of looks like a drifter and is just, not somebody they would think would have any money at all, he says, well, not on me.
Such a crazy
and
line.
The detective thinks, well, that's a really surprising answer. And sure enough, they give him bail, and he's out. He disappears, and he's on the run. And when I talked to Bob later, I said to him, and this turned out to be fairly important, I said to him, so when you got arrested in Galveston and they gave you a $250,000 bail, what did you do? You just left the money behind? You just exited? He says, yeah, of course. He says, I never understood why you would give somebody charged with murder a bail, because he's going to run away, of course. And later, when Bob was arrested,
jail, goodbye $250,000.
He has millions.
I'm out.
Yeah, he has millions.
Yeah,
what does it matter? But we're laughing. We're laughing about this, which you just can't help it because it's just so insane. But Zac, you mentioned in the podcast that you host that you did look at the autopsy of Morris, and it was an upsetting thing. It must have been also a weird feeling when you're trying to tell the story of just like one crazy thing after the other, but then you're actually really faced with a terribly violent death of more than one person.
The Morris pictures were something else. And it was like your brain doesn't want to compute it, Like it's like looking at an arm laying on the ground, like my brain wanted to believe like there's somebody on the other side of the curtain just with his hand like stuck through. And then the next picture would be like, oh no, it's flipped over and you see the bone exposed and it looks like raw meat. And just, I don't know how you do that. Like it's really hard to imagine.
Yeah. And important to keep in mind in the story, right? Because it is, like I said, just so it's stranger than fiction, but it is about humans who have lost their lives.
And he is funny, but he's also incredibly disturbing as a person.
But he gets away with it. So that also is just another layer of this insane story. So tell me about how he gets away with it.
Well, he goes to trial. Eventually they catch him. Big nationwide manhunt comes to a conclusion because Bob steals a chicken salad sandwich and a Band-Aid.
So he's not peeing on things this time, but he's just stealing weird things.
Yes. And he's changed his appearance. He's completely shaved all his hair on his face, his eyebrows, his head. Is a kind of incredible moment from season 1 where Andrew asks him, you shaved your eyebrows? Was that intentional?
It looks less like me. You look weird with your eyebrows shaved in addition to your head.
and that was intentional.
Yeah, how do you accidentally shave your eyebrows?
So he goes on trial and he hires the best defense team money can buy. Actually, two competing defense attorneys are arguing for his business, and he hires both of them. And he creates basically this dream team. And he gets on the stand and pretty much does the unthinkable. He admits that he dismembered Morris Black, but he says that he did it because both it was an accident and self-defense. And so the defense attorneys expertly argue that the decisions Bob made after this accident, of this accidental shooting of Morris Black in his apartment, the fact that he cut up the body, the fact that he disposed of the remains, that was bad, but that has no bearing on the murder of Morris Black. And the jury bought it.
Andrew, you talked to some of the jurors. Can you tell me about how it sort of went through their minds and how they possibly got to that answer in their heads?
Yes, we talked to a whole bunch of Galveston jurors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Galveston jury went through a couple of phases. There was a period, I think, when they heard the allegations, and I think they thought, well, obviously this is a grisly, terrible murder, and the man dismembered the corpse. It's going to be very hard to imagine a circumstance in which he's going to say, well, I dismembered this person, but somehow I wasn't the one that killed them, or somebody else killed them, or whatever. But the evolution of the jury was an interesting process, because there was one juror who you have gotten to know now, and certainly in part 1 and part 2, named Chris Lovell, who was very eager to get on the jury. He's kind of a cherubic little fella from Texas, and maybe gets less cherubic or less cute as time goes by. He becomes like one of those little stuffed animals that like suddenly is like in a horror movie and it has really sharp teeth. But he makes a strong effort to be picked for the jury. And then, according to Judge Chris, the judge who was running the trial in Galveston, from the very beginning, it's clear that there is a bond between Bob and Chris. Not that they necessarily knew each other before, but that Chris is just giving lots of little signals to Bob that he doesn't think the allegations are right. He can't talk to him, right? So he's sitting across the courtroom, but somebody says something mean about Bob, and Chris will roll his eyes, or Chris will look over and like, well, that doesn't sound true. And the judge said she could really see Chris trying to sort of curry favor with Bob. Simultaneously, Chris is going back into the jury room, and when they're forced to deliberate, he's going to start to play a very outsized role, because Chris does all kinds of stuff you're not supposed to do. He starts telling them about how firearms work, and actually this could never have happened. And then the judge finds out about it, and the judge says, Chris, you can't do that. You're not an expert in the case. You're just a juror. We don't care if you know about firearms. You're not supposed to tell the jury these expert things about firearms. You're not admitted as an expert. It's not your job. And he says, oh, okay, Judge, I won't do that anymore. And then the next day he'll go in and he'll say, remember what the judge said. You can't consider anything that happened after the gun went off and after Morris Black was dead. You can't unring a bell. You can't unstrike a match. Nothing after that moment of murder matters at all. Well, that's totally absurd, right? You could argue in court that somebody planned a bank robbery, and the way you can prove it is to say, well, his brother was sitting outside waiting in the car. Even though that happened after the bank robbery, it still is an indication of his guilt that he made a plan, right? So the dismemberment was, of course, part of the case, but Chris is kind of a spellbinder. Like Bob, he's a very persuasive, very dominant person. And even though there was a foreman on the jury, he sort of ignored that, and he made himself sort of the central person on the jury, and then created a kind of a narrative and got people to say, well, that's right. It seems like Bob is misunderstood, or I believe that woman, Janine Pirro, really was going after Bob. So they really ended up with a confederate of Bob's on the jury with the loudest voice in the room. And of course, later, Dick DeGuerin would take a bow for his incredible lawyering in Galveston, and he did a lot of good work there. But I don't see how he would have won that case without having a jury that included a guy who was fully in the tank with Bob. And of course, we learn later that Chris did get all kinds of financial benefits from Bob. Perhaps not before the verdict was rendered, but within months of that, he's visiting Bob in jail. He calls up Dick DeGuerin and says, well, I'd really like to meet Bob. And then eventually Bob hires him to be a contractor in his apartment. Then they stay friends for all these years. And by the end of part 2, when we see Chris Lovell again, he's gotten somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000 from Bob over the years.
Which we'll get to too, because I want to talk to you about the people that surrounded Bob and the idea of friendship and money and all that. But I want to get to sort of where all of this is sensational enough until your last episode of season 1, which is the most sensational of all. I want to talk to you about that. So you finally get this interview with him. And what Bob doesn't know is that you have evidence linking him to the famous cadaver note. So the cadaver note is a letter that got sent to the LAPD from the killer telling them that there was a dead body in Susan's house. What you have is another letter that we know was written by Bob that shows that the handwriting on the Bob letter and the cadaver note are exactly the same, and that the word Beverly is spelt wrong in both of those letters, in the one that we know Bob wrote and in the cadaver letter. This was a really big moment. Can you set it up for us? Because you looked nervous, at least to us. I want to know sort of what was happening inside of you and what you were hoping to do with this meeting.
What we'll call the second interview?
Yeah, like the big one.
Well, first of all, it was really hard to set that meeting with Bob. And I think what was driving that was in the very beginning when Bob called me, saw the movie, said, well, let's do something together. In his mind, it was going to be a DVD extra. It was going to be a way for him to talk to somebody who didn't know all that much about the case, but knew something about the case. And he was going to be able to sort of put the story out there that he wanted out there. He felt kind of maligned in the world. And so, as he said to me, I would like there to be something out there from me. But I think his perception of that was, let's do a 20-minute interview together. Whatever it is, let's get it up on television. It'll be something for me to point to and say I'm not a bad guy. What he didn't anticipate is that we were going to have sort of an evolving process where clearly, like Zac and I and our partner Mark, over time, we're learning more and more and more. And then 5 years went by, right? We were working on the Jinx for 5 years. And so from Bob's standpoint, we were either very silly people or
incompetent
or very lazy people or something. And Bob was confused by that. And as things started to wear on and it started taking a lot longer, I think he had a sense that maybe we were digging more deeply into it. And I would call him up and say, I need to talk to more people. I want to talk to your friend. I want to talk to somebody else. And so he didn't like the idea that we were doing all this sniffing around. And we were worried that he was never going to come back to the table. Even though when we did the first interview, he said, well, if you ever need me to answer any more questions, I'm an open book. But then eventually it became clear that he really didn't want to do the follow-up. It had all just taken too long and he didn't understand what we were at. And then finally we do have a reason to be back in touch with him. And he finally sort of says, okay, I'll do it. And then he comes in for the interview. And we knew very clearly what we needed to do was to show him the evidence, to show him that his note to Susan Berman matched, that the handwriting matched, that the misspelling of the word Beverly matched. And we thought we would get an interesting reaction from him. And we wanted to do all that before we reached out to law enforcement because we knew that, and we had talked to lawyers and Marcia Clark especially, who's a very smart prosecutor, and she had said, listen, if you have the opportunity to get him back in the chair and to get him to react to this evidence, that's a really powerful piece of film to have. And that's not something that a police officer is ever going to be able to do. And you have to do it before you ever go to the police, because if you don't, then later he's going to claim, probably successfully, that you guys were somehow in cahoots with law enforcement and you were working with them and therefore they were directing your activity. Maybe they asked you to ask some certain questions. And in that case, you should have read him his Miranda rights. And so there would have been a whole other animal. So we decided we had to just keep pushing to get Bob in the chair. And then we did. And we knew that's what we wanted to show him. Going in there, Zac and I rehearsed. To say we rehearsed this is an understatement. I mean, we spent weeks writing the questions and mixing up the questions. We wanted to ask him questions that weren't just in sequence. We wanted to show him some photographs so that he would not be suspicious of, what the purpose of the interview was. And then Zac and I did a mock interview where Zac played Bob and I played me, and we filmed it, and really talked through at every turn what were the questions I was going to ask, how we would do it. And Zac did it actually uncannily good job at answering the questions. Like, we knew later we're going to see Bob say, well, block letters or block
letters are block letters.
It's almost exactly what Zac said when we did it in our little rehearsal.
They look very similar, but they're block letters. I mean, block letters look similar. They're block letters.
And so then we bring Bob. We spent the day with him in Times Square, walking around town, shooting different footage with him. And then we go back to the Regency Hotel where we were in a conference room, and we started the second interview. And, we had planned to do a whole bunch of sort of decoy questions up front, just random questions, and then eventually say, well, I'd like to show you this letter. And I show him the letter. And you can see my hands are shaking a little bit. I am nervous because we've been waiting so long for this to happen. And we know that he's a volatile person. We don't know how he's going to react to it. We set a camera in like a clock radio on the bookshelf in case he got up and, freaked out and threw things over or something like that. We had a guy out on the median in Park Avenue shooting when he came out because we just didn't know how he was going to react. We thought he would have a quite, visible, notable reaction to it. But when I show it to him, I say, well, I want to show you this letter.
Susie, now and again I think about old times. GG, good luck, Bobby.
Do you remember writing this to Susan?
No, not at all.
My theory is that this probably was you sending her some support.
That's possible. That certainly is possible. I can easily see writing that letter and putting a check in there.
He sort of anticipates, I get where they're going with this.
I want to show you the envelope that letter came in. Would you read me the address on this envelope?
Robert Durst, floor 24, 67 Wall Street, New York, 10005.
And who you sent it to?
Susan Berman, 1527 Benedict Canyon, Beverly Hills, California. Beverly spelled wrong, California, 90210.
Then I say, well, now I want to show you the cadaver note.
So obviously I want to ask you about the cadaver note. Can you read me the spelling of Beverly Hills?
Police, 1527 Benedict Canyon, cadaver. Same misspelling.
And when he sees this letter that he doesn't remember having written Susan Berman, or he figures it's been lost to the sands of time, you can tell he's already reacting. And when I show him the comparison to the cadaver note, he has this really physical reaction. He starts burping and rubbing his face.
Well, the writing looks similar and the spelling is the same, so I can see the conclusion the cops would draw, or the writing exemplar person would conclude they were both written by the same person.
You really see, in a way, I don't know whether it was guilt or just the anticipation of this, but he's having kind of a gastric reaction to it. And we had made a little exhibit where we just had the Beverly Hills, and the handwriting was so incredibly similar. And of course, the misspelling of the word Beverly with the extra E. And so I just show him the little exhibit and I said,
and can you tell me which one you didn't write?
And there's a pause and he says, no.
No.
And so we thought, okay, that's it. That's what we came for. We've been working for literally years to get to this point. And so I asked him a number of other questions that are sort of innocuous so that it didn't feel to him like that was the world's biggest gotcha, because I figured we would need to have some kind of continuing relationship. So I kind of buy his explanation about it, block letters or block letters. And then we let him go. He gets up to go to the bathroom. He talks to Zac a little bit about a sandwich. Zac offers him a sandwich. Oh, these are nice sandwiches. And then he goes to the bathroom and closes the door. And we sit in that other room.
Right. He goes to the bathroom, closes the door. And I want to ask Zac, the cameras are turned off. The mics aren't. But it takes you a while to get to the next thing. So tell us how you discovered the next thing.
Yeah. Well, it's over a year later. a very talented editor named Shelby Siegel is hired, and one of her first tasks is like, hey, can you rewatch all of the Bob material now that we know it's a series and we're making it into these episodes? Like, what should we put in? And she's coming up with like, oh, he says something really great about this that's not in there, and that kind of thing. And then one afternoon, I hear screaming from the other, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. So she races into my office and says, have you heard this thing? He says, there it is, you're caught.
There it is, you're caught.
And I'm like, oh my gosh. Like we go and we said, there it is, you're caught. I mean, our heads exploded. Like, it was just like wild. We call Andrew, and this is all covered in the podcast.
Yeah.
It's really incredible just to hear us, like, hearing it all for the first time.
Hey, the big news over here.
What's going on?
Zach, tell Andrew what you just told me. Shelby was watching through the Bob interview again. She got to the very end of the day. I'm like packing up a sandwich for him. He's going to take it with him to go. He goes into the bathroom and he's still got his mic on. And the door closes and it's like the first moment he has by himself. And he says to himself, there it is. You're caught. Andrew? Andrew, are you on the ground?
That's amazing. I remember that.
Andrew, you do not react the way I thought you'd react on that phone call. You sounded way too calm. Were you just in shock?
I think I was in shock.
I was like, what is he
I think
doing?
I was
Is
like,
he asleep?
It was like, it's, I think I was just feeling like, I just want to concentrate on what these guys are saying to me. Because I think you had called me before that and said, we're going to tell you something.
Yeah.
You should be on camera for this.
Yes.
So I think I had the time to go and like set up my iPhone or hand it to my son or something like that. And then I walked over there and I remember the feeling of like, okay, I'm about to find out something that's important because they've never done this before. You know, nobody's called me and said like, okay, go and set yourself up to be filmed while this is happening.
Yeah.
So my mind is racing. You know, I think when Zac tells me that Shelby has found this, you know, it was basically a little squiggle. It was a little electronic squiggle.
Yeah.
She's looking at the editing software and sort of cleaning up the audio, and she looks up, and on Bob's microphone, where it should be silent, or he should have gone into the bathroom, there's this little wobbly line, and she thinks, well, I don't understand. Why is there talking in the bathroom? And so she mutes the other tracks, right? Because there were other tracks going on. I was being recorded. I was whispering to Zac. We were excited that we knew that we had just gotten Bob to admit that he couldn't tell the difference between these two pieces of handwriting and these two notes. And we thought, okay, we have an ending for our show, and this is what we came for. And something else is going on. So when she mutes my track, the track where I'm talking to people, and she just isolates that one track, and she hears Bob goes in the bathroom, and the first thing he says is, there it is, you're caught. And Zac says, oh my God, but also I was there. And Bob was in the bathroom for 6 or 7 minutes.
Yeah.
He's got to say other stuff in the bathroom. And they had not brought that other material in. And they went to a hard drive that we had never even dug into. And then they imported that and they listened to it. And suddenly there is another 6 or 7 minutes of Bob talking, including saying, killed them all, of course.
And that's like, if you made a list of the things like, oh, what would we want him to say in the bathroom? Like, you wouldn't put that on because it's too on the nose. You'd be like, that'd be crazy. Like, and I remember, like, it just was unbelievable. We were all there together. Like, Shelby and I are like holding hands. Like, it was just, it was like an out of body experience.
Yeah. And it was for viewers. I have to tell you, it was pretty amazing. Saying that it was pretty amazing is almost underselling it. It was one of the wildest moments in TV history. Robert Durst admitting to murder on a hot mic. As a result, police reopened Susan Berman's case and arrested Bob for her murder. We're going to talk about all of that and so much more in part 2 of my behind-the-scenes conversation with Andrew Jarecki and Zac Stuart-Pontier. You can hear part 2 next Monday. You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. We drop a new episode every Monday. You can get our next episode a week early on CBC Podcasts' YouTube channel or by subscribing to the CBC Podcast True Crime channel on Apple Podcasts. In addition to early access, subscribers to our True Crime channel also listen ad-free. Crime Story is written and hosted by me. Our producers are Alexis Green and Sarah Clayton. Sound design by Graham McDonald. Our senior producer is Jeff Turner. Our video producer is Evan Agard. Our YouTube producer is John Lee. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is CBC Podcast Senior Manager, and Arif Noorani is the Director of CBC Podcasts.